Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Rivkah Brown, and I'm delighted to be joined by the very sun-kissed Aaron Bastani, who's just returned from holiday in Malta. How are you doing, Aaron?
Very well. I wish I was even more sun-kissed, but I'm very grateful to be co-hosting your, I believe, first show as host on
No,
Novara
my
Live.
second, actually. It's
Second.
only my second, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, the fact that you're not very sun-kissed is a very diligent reflection, I'm sure, of your covering yourself in Factor 50, which we should all be doing these days. Coming up later tonight, energy bills are set to rise this autumn, bringing them to nearly double what they were before the energy crisis began in 2021. Israel continues to relentlessly bomb Gaza, killing over 16 people today alone, all while apparently working diligently on a ceasefire without Hamas's involvement. But first, to Chicago. You can let us know via the super chat or tweet us on the hashtag Novara Live about all of our stories in tonight's episode. First story. The Democratic National Convention reached its climax last night with a keynote speech from the party's 2024 presidential candidate, Kamala Harris. Receiving several standing ovations from the nearly 5,000 delegates at the convention, the vice president accepted the presidential nomination from the Democratic Party and set out her stall for why the country should vote for her in November. Harris is currently narrowly leading Trump by 3.3 percentage points nationally, although in 5 key battleground states of Michigan, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Pennsylvania, Harris is either tied with or trailing her opponent, which might explain why she spent most of her 40 minutes convention speech laying into her Republican rival.
The consequences of putting Donald Trump back in the White House are extremely serious. Consider not only the chaos and calamity when he was in office, but also the gravity of what has happened since he lost the last election. Donald Trump tried to throw away your votes. When he failed, he sent an armed mob to the United States Capitol where they assaulted law enforcement officers. When politicians in his own party begged him to call off the mob and send help, he did the opposite. He fanned the flames. And now, for an entirely different set of crimes, he was found guilty of fraud by a jury of everyday Americans and separately found liable for committing sexual abuse. And consider what he intends to do if we give him power again. Consider his explicit intent to set free violent extremists who assaulted those law enforcement officers at the Capitol. His explicit intent to jail journalists, political opponents, and anyone he sees as the enemy. His explicit intent to deploy our active duty military against our own citizens. Consider the power he will have, especially after the United States Supreme Court just ruled that he would be immune from criminal prosecution. Just imagine Donald Trump with no guardrails.
Kamala Harris there, very much positioning herself as the prosecutor-in-chief, not unlike our own Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. She, at other points in her speech, talks about herself as being, as having only one client, the people, and very much playing up her credentials as a former prosecutor to lay into Trump effectively, completely doing away with the Obama sort of edict of when they go low, we go high. I mean, nothing really below the belt, I'd say, but pretty all guns blazing. And that might be because of a lack of anything positive to propose. One of the key issues, though, that Harris skewered Trump on was abortion. This has been a major theme of this year's Democratic Convention, an easy vote winner in a country that hates more than anything to have its rights taken away. One convention speaker talked about becoming pregnant at 12 after being raped by her stepfather. Hadley Duval expressed her fear that women and girls in similar positions wouldn't be able to get an abortion under Trump. Since Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022 by a Supreme Court stacked by Trump, only a quarter of the 22 US states that now prohibit abortions make allowances for rape and incest. And nearly all of those require proof in the form of a police report or a doctor's note. Here's what Harris had to say about the dangers of a Trump presidency for people's right to choose whether or not to be pregnant.
As a part of his agenda, he and his allies would limit access to birth control, ban medication abortion, and enact a nationwide abortion ban with or without Congress. And get this, he plans to create a national anti-abortion coordinator and force states to report on women's miscarriages and abortions. Simply put, they are out of their minds. And one must ask, why exactly is it that they don't trust women? Well, we trust women. We trust women.
We trust women, except, I guess, if those women are Palestinian prisoners of Israel who say that they've been raped in custody, for example, I guess. But anyway, when it came to the economy, Harris's speech was thin on detail. She gave a long spiel about the middle class and how passionately she identifies with it. Seems to me something uniquely American about being so enamored with the middle class. She also painted in broad brushstrokes a marginally more affordable and better housed America.
And as president, I will bring together labor and workers and small business owners and entrepreneurs and American companies to create jobs, to grow our economy, and to lower the cost of everyday needs like healthcare and housing and groceries. We will provide access to capital for small business owners and entrepreneurs and founders. And we will end America's housing shortage and protect Social Security and Medicare.
I mean, the only actual concrete proposal I heard, and that was giving capital to capitalists. But I mean, I guess the devil's in the detail. Curiously absent from Kamala Harris's speech was any mention of a proposal that she made, her first concrete economic proposal, which was a federal ban on food and grocery price gouging. Perhaps this was because Harris's proposed price gouging ban has already been rattling big businesses since it was announced a few days ago. The US retail giant Target saw its profits increase by almost $2 billion in 2023. And earlier this week, its chief executive hit back at Harris's price gouging proposal. Speaking on CNBC, Brian Cornell said that food is a, quote, penny business and already extremely competitive, far too competitive to allow for price gouging. Weird. How come a 2021 analysis by The Guardian found that 4 or fewer firms control 79% of American groceries? Harris's price gouging proposal has also been seized upon by Trump, who called it Soviet-style price controls. Aaron, do you think Comrade Kamala is just trying to keep her powder dry between now and November, or does her lack of detail on economic policy suggest she's going to ditch even the kind of excesses of Bidenomics, which majored somewhat on infrastructure spending and accepted the need for a higher deficit in order to stimulate growth?
Well, a few things. Firstly, Joe Biden was the most radical interventionist president of my lifetime. I was born in 1984. I mean, that doesn't say very much. but he was. The CHIPS Act, the IRA Act, were huge interventions in the economy, probably the biggest interventions in the economy outside of, explicit Defense Department spending since Lyndon Johnson. Extraordinary historic intervention to reshore things like microprocessor manufacture back to the United States. Massive. And of course, Biden prevailed in the 2020 election really on vibes, on COVID. And it's paradoxical, therefore, that actually, in terms of the nitty-gritty of industrial policy, he was a historic president. He was a big deal. If you're a German technology firm right now, you're looking at the cost of energy in the US compared to Germany. You're looking at the tax breaks and you're thinking, you know what, I might relocate to Texas or California or Michigan. These are really, really big shifts. In terms of the substance of Kamala Harris, she's nowhere near that kind of stuff. But then, of course, Biden in 2020 was nowhere near that stuff either. It was really in government where we saw, like I say, actually quite historic policies being enacted. What she has said is that each new family will get a $6,000, I think, tax break, or effectively a federal payment with a new child. You'll see a $25,000 payment to help first-time buyers get on the housing ladder. That will help, of course, in the short term. I'm sure many young Americans will be very grateful for those kinds of policies. What it means, however, particularly that second one, is simply a further inflation of the US housing market. And it's really helping with demand, of course, but not with supply, and certainly not with landlordism or speculative property construction industries. So there's some positive stuff there. It's nowhere near where Biden is. But I have to say, I watched that speech and she's more impressive than I've given her credit for. That's not saying much, because I've seen Kamala Harris as kind of like a meme joke. But she's a more impressive politician than I think many have given her credit for hitherto, certainly from the left. Now, does that mean very much? Does that mean very much in the context of US politics? I don't know. But I think she's a massive upgrade on Joe Biden, given the state of his cognitive decline. And I think the American electorate is probably going to respond accordingly. Whether or not she wins, I think the Democrats will win in November. There's still a long way to go. There's lots of variables. We're going to talk about some of them. I think it's inarguable she's a better candidate to put to the public than Joe Biden.
Yeah, I definitely see that. And I think, I think in many ways she is playing a similar game to Joe Biden, which is just, and perhaps even to Keir Starmer, we might say, which is allowing your rivals to lose rather than attempting to kind of overpromise ahead of the election and sort of underdeliver. But I also think that, Kamala Harris has not got the same kind of track record as Joe Biden. So it's difficult to tell what kind of president she would be. She's been thrust into the limelight. She herself acknowledged in her convention speech, it's an unexpected moment for her to be pitching for the presidency. So the question is, does she even have any of the same kind of depth of ideas and understanding of this kind of high level policymaking as someone like Biden, who had literally decades of experience by the time he probably too advanced a stage in his kind of physical decline, became president,
Yeah, so why did the US engage in the CHIPS Act, right? Which is about making the United States once more this microprocessor, superconductor, mega power. It's about freezing out China. It's about destroying Chinese capacity in things like 5G, chip manufacture, mobile telephony, etc. AI ultimately is the big goal. How do we stop China from being world number one on AI? That's what drove the CHIPS Act, alongside those sanctions that were being placed and tariffs that were being placed on Chinese goods. Electric vehicles too. Now, the US, I think, invariably, whoever governs, is going in a more interventionist, big state direction. Why? Well, I think some people that watch and listen to Novara or other left-wing sort of journalists out there will be saying, well, it's because, Labour's won, we've won the argument, socialism's back, or social democracy's back, or at least, a belief in the state being able to do good stuff, that's back. The reason really is that, the US is a declining global hegemon, and that in order to remain a global hegemon, yes, it's going to have to move away from the neoliberal economics, the minimal state, laissez-faire economics that have prevailed really since the early 1980s. If they want to keep on with that, then China will absolutely be number one in global EVs, in microprocessors, in 5G, in the world and its wife. And look, if you actually look at the biggest companies in the world today. What are they? Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Tesla, Meta. I just named 4 or 5 companies. They're all worth more than $500 billion, I believe. You have NVIDIA as well. These are, in some cases, multi-trillion-dollar companies. Now, the reason why the United States is the world number one in global technology companies is because of state-led investment, state-led policy, from investing in technology research in Californian universities in the 1960s to having ARPANET, which was the predecessor to the internet, built for the US Armed Forces a decade or two later. That is the result of dirigisme and state intervention. And I think, the ruling class of the United States, faced with the possibility of a rival peer power with China, not just militarily and economically, but most importantly, technologically, they've had to relearn those lessons. So I think Kamala Harris will continue in that direction of Joe Biden. That's not because she's a social democrat. That's not because she's a Labour woman, but it's because US empire is under threat from the East, and they have to respond. And first and foremost in that response is retaining that number one position in global technology innovation.
Sure. I mean, one area in which she definitely is going to be continuing in Joe Biden's footsteps is in her approach on Israel, which is interesting because Biden is a out and out Zionist. He's got a sort of sentimental attachment to Zionism. Kamala Harris, it's much more political. Harris couldn't finish her Democratic convention speech, of course, without mentioning the ongoing genocide in Gaza, or as she would call it, the war between Israel and Hamas. A very brief mention, of course, as she focused almost exclusively on Israel's security needs.
With respect to the war in Gaza, President Biden and I are working around the clock, because now is the time to get a hostage deal and a ceasefire deal done. And let me be clear, I will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, and I will always ensure Israel has the ability to defend itself, because the people of Israel must never again face the horror that a terrorist organization called Hamas caused on October 7, including unspeakable sexual violence and the massacre of young people at a music festival. At the same time, what has happened in Gaza over the past 10 months is devastating. So many innocent lives lost. Desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety over and over again. The scale of suffering is heartbreaking. President Biden and I are working to end this war such that Israel is secure, the hostages are released, the suffering in Gaza ends, and the Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, security, freedom, and self-determination.
So interesting, isn't it? The language that Harris uses to describe the 7th of October attacks and, everything that's happened since then. She's so clear about how Hamas caused. It's so active. It's not just Hamas carried out by Hamas. Hamas caused the chaos and the horror, whereas what happened since in Gaza is heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking what has happened, she says, as if it's a sort of act of God, as if there's been a tsunami or an earthquake, people running for their lives with, only, sort of with no possible cause or no possible sort of actor involved. It's also so interesting, isn't it? How, she talks about Palestinians' right to self-determination. That's the kind of culmination of that clip that we just gave there. It reminds me almost of, Oprah Winfrey, who actually incidentally speaks at the DNC, when she, back in the day, if any of you have seen that episode where she's pointing out into the audience on the Oprah Winfrey show saying, you get a car, you get a car, you get a car. And every single member of the audience has won a prize guy's car. You Palestinian, you get the right of determination, you get the right of determination. But ultimately, these rights are meaningless. Liberals love to talk about rights and hate to talk about justice because rights are only realizable in the context of justice. There is no Palestinian self-determination without an end to the US supply of weapons to Israel. Just as, it's exactly the same, incidentally, with the right to abortion, which Kamala Harris is kind of majoring on in her conference speech, and the convention entirely kind of focuses on. Liberals will talk about how women and people need the right to abortion, but without an increase in the minimum wage, poor people only really have one choice to make. There is no choice without justice. There is no Palestinian self-determination without an end to US weapons to Israel. Biden and Harris's repeated insistence that they are, quote, working around the clock to secure a ceasefire is wearing extremely thin by this point. They're certainly working around the clock to ensure that Israel can continue its total war, mostly on Palestinian civilians. Since the war began in October, the US has withheld just a single shipment of arms, including around 1,800 2,000-pound bombs. But don't get too excited. Just last week, Biden approved $20 billion in arms sales to Israel. This just 2 days before ceasefire talks were due to begin in Cairo. How the US thinks 50 new fighter jets are going to help bring peace to the Middle East is beyond me. The Democratic Party, in fact, has tightly controlled who is allowed to say what about Palestine at this convention. Bernie and AOC were allowed a few words, but no Palestinians were allowed to speak. Even the party's own Palestinian-American Congresswoman, Rashida Tlaib. Outside the convention hall in Chicago, Congresswoman for Minnesota's 5th District, Ilhan Omar, gave an unofficial speech slamming her colleagues' empty promises of a ceasefire and their continued arms sales to Israel.
It's been unconscionable for me in the last 10 months to witness my colleagues in this administration refusing to recognize the genocidal war that is taking place in Gaza, to not see the mothers who have lost countless children, the babies whose dead bodies are being dug out, to not understand that working tirelessly for a ceasefire is really not a thing, and they should be ashamed of themselves for saying such thing. Because we supply these weapons. So if you really wanted a ceasefire, you just stop sending the weapons.
That's right.
It is that simple.
That's right.
I think I've heard it said recently that, the demand for a ceasefire is something quite similar to the demand for a two-state solution. It's become this kind of obsession of the kind of pro-Israel center-left, this unrealizable demand that is completely disconnected from and disjointed with the reality on the ground. I think as one uncommitted delegate from Minnesota put it during Harris's Veep pick, Tim Walz's convention speech, it's weird to say ceasefire and keep sending the fire. That's weird, Walz. In reality, Ilhan Omar is one of vanishingly few people with any power in the Democratic Party to give a rat's ass about Gaza. She was one of 9 congresspeople to attend a vigil for Gaza in December last year. That's right, 9 out of 535. While Omar speaks up about Palestinian liberation, the rest of the Democratic Party, including supposed squad member Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, has decided they're happy to throw Palestinians under a bus in order to get Harris elected. Meanwhile, here was the reaction of some DNC delegates as they left the convention center, having the names of dead Palestinian children read to them.
The blood of these children is on your hands! 13 years old! Sama Abullin! 13
Say it again. Say it again. Mock them again. Mock the children again. Do it again. Do it again.
18 years old! 13 years old! Yusuf Hassan! 8 years old! Turn around and join the uncommitted delegates in the protest.
putting their fingers in their ears and saying, la, 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 shouting in mockery. Imagine what kind of a sociopath you have to be to grin at the sound of a dead child's name. Aaron, 4 in 10 Americans in an Ipsos poll from May say that the US is doing too much to support Israel in Gaza, which is up from 3 in 10 in January. Can Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party keep putting their fingers in their ears, like some of the delegates we saw just there? Or will they at some point have to listen to so many voters who are angry, who are upset, and in some cases who are uncommitted, who are withholding their votes?
It's such a great question. Look, if the race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump boils down to Michigan, and Harris loses on the state of Michigan, which is a reasonably big state, Trump wins it in 2016 by a tiny margin. Biden wins it in 2020 by a decent margin, but not huge. It's very much a bellwether swing state. 2% of it is Arab American. If the Democrats lose Michigan, then people will reflect, and subsequently, Trump wins the presidency, he's won the Electoral College. People will reflect on this issue as a major point. A major inflection point will be Gaza and how the Democratic Party handled it. I don't think that's likely, personally. I think if the Democrats lose Michigan, they've probably lost a few other places as well, but it's plausible. So it's certainly not something that the Democrats can ignore. But I have to say, when you look at people who are discontented with US foreign policy, who are they? It's not all left-wing people, young people on university campuses. It's older people. It can be younger people. It's not just with regards to Israel. It can be Ukraine. And actually, the isolationist current that rejects the last, in some cases, 80 years of US foreign policy are actually Republicans. It's people on the right. It's people like Tucker Carlson. So it's a really difficult one to work out. It's clearly one issue amongst many. If you look at the polling in Michigan, that state where, like I said, it's the state with the most Arab Americans, several 100,000 Arab Americans. You look at the polling there, I think until late last month, Trump was marginally ahead, but with the shift in candidate, now Kamala Harris is again marginally ahead, though I should say it's the margin of error. So this could be an issue that really does spike the Democrats. I don't think it will necessarily, but it could. We make these shows 5 days a week, and everybody will forget all of these. And hopefully, if we get it right, we can say this clip, I said this 6 months ago. It's very possible, right? But in mainstream analysis, you won't often hear this. Michigan is a must-win state. There's 4 or 5 of them up for grabs, very marginal. And actually, Gaza is a massive issue for people in that state. Others too, of course, but a massive issue in that state. So that's really where it rests. In terms of the fundamentals of what the Democratic Party and the US government are doing right now, you're absolutely right. 99%, and this is not a phrase I've plucked from the air, literally 99% of arms sales to Israel by value are coming from 2 countries, Germany, the United States. If you want a ceasefire, those 2 countries have to stop selling them weapons. It's very good that people campaign and engage in direct action to stop arms sales from this country to Israel. That's having some effect. We don't know how much yet. But the reality is that the UK's military-industrial relationship with Israel consists in really helping to maintain F-35s, arguably helping to build certain engines for certain drones, etc. But actually the hardware that is being used in Gaza on an hourly basis is almost entirely built by German and US industrial contractors. So that is obviously the first port of call if you want a ceasefire. Literally stop selling the weapons, literally stop giving them billions of dollars of US taxpayers' money, which, by the way, is a very popular position. But I do think, electorally speaking, Rivkah, the people that will benefit from that in the short term, by which I don't mean November, by the way, because Trump's position is hardly radical. But I do think over the next several years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, you will begin to see bubbling up very isolationist US political figures. They, of course, have primarying establishment Republicans on giving money to Ukraine, on giving money to Israel. I mean, that's starting to happen already. Finally, on your point about the squad, only 9 people turned up. We have to remember, I think 2 of the people there actually, Bowman and Cori Bush, they've both been primary. They both lost. So they will not be the Democratic candidates in their respective races for the next time round. They have primaries in the United States. A bit like mandatory selection in this country, of course. For the British media, that's Stalinism. Nobody tell them that's exactly what they have across the Atlantic. So that is a real problem for somebody like AOC. I'm not saying that she should be doing what she's doing. I don't think she should. I think she's wrong for what she's doing. But that's going to be part of her calculation in terms of re-election efforts. And the astonishing thing with that is they lost those races because of AIPAC. Because you have this extraordinarily powerful organization in US public life, literally spending massive amounts of money. This is not, I'm not talking metaphorically. They are investing in specific races to target the small handful of, I won't even call them pro-Gaza. I'd call them pro-human rights, pro-life, pro-rule of law. People like Cory Bush, like Bowman, like I say, AOC, Ilhan Omar, other ones too, Rashida Tlaib. There's others too, but 2 have already been gotten. I suspect there'll be more coming too. And when this happens, by the way, AIPAC say, we did it. We got them out.
Yeah.
The money worked. And we've had, for 8 years, this idea of Russia, Iran, China, interfering in the politics of the United States or the United Kingdom. You have, in the form of AIPAC, an organization explicitly trying to fund efforts in order to undermine critics of Israel. Now, AIPAC is very overt in its support of Israel and what purpose it serves. So I think maybe it's time we stop talking about Russia and China and focus a little bit more on Israel and actually Zionism's efforts to shape US foreign policy, often in direct opposition to the actual interests of the United States and its citizens.
And the desires of the United States and its citizens. And it is so notable, isn't it, that Kamala Harris's speech kind of majors on, Trump's vote, restriction of the vote to certain people. And he's like, he threw away your votes. And, there were speakers who were saying, we saw massive queues outside of our polling stations. And it's like, when are we going to talk about the manipulative effect, the enormously determinative effect that money has on US politics, and particularly AIPAC money? Billions and billions, record amounts have been funneled into this particular cycle, targeting just the squad. And perhaps that is what's going through AOC's mind when she's thinking, do I want to be in the Ilhan Omar camp and say that saying a ceasefire is bullshit? Or do I want to be on the kind of Kamala Harris train and just kind of, tuck myself in behind her, keep my job, and I don't know, maybe have some influence after the election? It's an interesting question. Give money to Novara. Novara needs your support in an ongoing fashion. We, unlike AIPAC, unlike Kamala Harris and US politics, are not saturated with AIPAC money. And that means that we're free to criticize people like AIPAC because nobody tells us what to write. Nobody tells us what to cover and what not to cover. And trust me, I've worked in mainstream media organizations where that literally does happen. I've seen the kind of, I want to say henchmen, but they're usually quite reedy, of newspaper owners coming downstairs from their lofty offices and literally putting pieces to publish on our desk. And we don't allow that because we rely on people like you to give us small amounts of money every month. We recommend 1 hour's wage a month. So if you earn £10 an hour, give £10. If you earn £100 an hour, if you're a lawyer and you earn £100 an hour, give us £100. Novara.media/support. Diplomatic efforts have continued this week to produce the much talked about but very much non-existent ceasefire in Gaza. While US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has scarcely paused for breath since the 7th of October, visiting Israel 9 times in that period, his pleas for peace in the region appear to amount to little more than hot air. Israeli strikes have killed at least 16 people in Gaza in the last 24 hours. An Associated Press reporter has confirmed 3 children amongst those killed. In further evidence of the rapidly deteriorating conditions of Gaza, a case of polio has been discovered in the enclave for the first time in a quarter of a century. It's the kind of illness that you simply don't even hear of in the UK these days. A 10-month-old child has been confirmed as infected, according to the head of the World Health Organization. Israel's continued pursuit of the obliteration of the Palestinian people by bomb, bullet, starvation, and disease is hardly a sign of a good faith negotiator. Yet Israeli negotiators are today in Cairo to resume talks with counterparts from the US, Egypt, and Qatar. Hamas will not take part, after Israel refused the group's core demand for a complete military withdrawal from Gaza. Instead, Israel has reportedly agreed to the US's bridging proposal, designed to resolve areas of disagreement between Israel and Hamas in 3 phases. The first phase of the bridging proposal would be a 6-week ceasefire and withdrawal of Israeli forces from all populated areas of Gaza, and the exchange of some Israeli hostages for some Palestinian prisoners of Israel. The second phase would be the release of all other living hostages and a permanent ceasefire. The third phase would be a reconstruction plan for Gaza and the return of dead hostages' remains. The all-populated areas bit is crucial. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reportedly insisted that Israeli troops continue to be stationed along 2 corridors in the Strip indefinitely. Those 2 pieces of land include the Philadelphia corridor in the south of the enclave, encompassing Gaza's only border with another country, namely Egypt, and the Netzarim corridor in central Gaza, cleared by Israel since the 7th of October and separating the north of the territory, which includes Gaza City, from the south. Israeli control of the Philadelphia corridor would mean a restriction on the movement of Palestinians between Egypt and Gaza, while Israeli control of the Netzarim corridor would restrict their movement inside their own territory. No wonder Netanyahu has called the corridors strategic assets. Nor is it any surprise that Hamas can't accept those terms. And yet, Israel is pressing ahead with its impossible demands anyway. Why? Well, Netanyahu claims that the corridors will protect Israeli security and prevent Hamas smuggling weapons into the Strip. Others have offered 2 alternative explanations. The first is that by refusing to entertain a comprehensive ceasefire, Netanyahu is deliberately tanking negotiations because he wants to draw out the war as long as possible, slowly eroding Palestinian morale and, grimly, its population. 6.7% of Gazans are either dead, injured, or missing. But according to a former Israeli commander, a lengthy war of attrition could cost Israel dearly. If Israel continues its 2-front war against Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, Israel will collapse within a year. That's the warning from Major General Yitzhak Brik, who was troops commander of the Israel Defense Forces Armored Corps, as well as IDF ombudsman for a decade. Amazing, by the way, when you look at how many former IDF senior officials opposed the war and Netanyahu's entire premiership. Brik has previously said that the war is purposeless and will blow up in our faces sooner or later. Writing in the left-leaning Israeli newspaper Haaretz, Brik has escalated his previous warnings, saying this: Israel is sinking deeper into the Gazan mud, losing more and more soldiers as they get killed or wounded, without any chance of achieving the war's main goal, bringing down Hamas. The country really is galloping towards the edge of an abyss. If the war of attrition against Hamas and Hezbollah continues, Israel will collapse within no more than a year. He goes on to say this: terror attacks are intensifying in the West Bank and inside the country. The reservist army is voting with its feet following recurring mobilizations of combat soldiers, and the economy is crashing. Israel has also become a pariah state, prompting economic boycotts and an embargo on arms shipments. We are also losing our social resilience as the growing hatred between different parts of the nation threatens to ignite and bring to its destruction from within. All that Brik says here is correct. Israel is losing to injury a reported 1,000 soldiers each month. Its desperation for boots on the ground has seen it call up 15,000 reservists previously exempt from frontline service, and some are refusing the order. A poll by Pew Research conducted in March and April showed that 68% of Israelis are concerned about the war dragging on. Week after week, thousands of protesters have poured into the streets of Tel Aviv, demanding a ceasefire and the release of the hostages, whose welfare is widely seen as being sacrificed on the altar of Netanyahu's war. Even if it can persuade its citizens to continue the fight, it's unclear whether Israel will be able to support a years-long war. Israel's economy is foundering. The credit bureau Fitch recently downgraded the country's credit rating, meaning borrowing will become more expensive for the state. Fitch also issued a negative outlook, suggesting to markets that further downgrades are possible. Meanwhile, the Bank of Israel has estimated the war will cost more than $55 billion if it continues into 2025, to be funded largely by borrowing. 60,000 Israeli businesses are expected to go bust by the end of the year due to manpower shortages. The lucrative tourist industry has collapsed, and Israel has been frantically flogging the silverware through international bond auctions. It really doesn't look good. But the blame, argues Brick, lies squarely with Netanyahu. Netanyahu's recent announcement to the families of hostages about the need to preserve security assets in Gaza, a blatant lie, has effectively torpedoed the deal, leading to a catastrophe not only for the hostages and their families, but also for the entire country. All of the paths chosen by Israel's political and military leadership are leading the country down a slippery slope. One dictator controls the fate of the country, and a flock of sheep follows him blindly. Netanyahu's decided to, quote, die with the Philistines, in this case, the citizens of Israel, only to retain his power. Of course, it isn't just Hamas that Israel is contending with. There is still the chance that Iran will retaliate over Israel's assassination of Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, an escalation that Israel can't afford. Then there is the ongoing battle with Hezbollah across Israel's northern border, with Israel reportedly considering an invasion of Lebanon. Again, that seems a step leading the country closer to collapse rather than victory. And yet, Israel drew a little nearer to a second all-out war today, with the IDF confirming it has killed Hezbollah commander Mohammed Mahmoud Najam on Lebanese soil. Aaron, Netanyahu seems doggedly committed to war at all costs. Is there any way a political settlement in Cairo will end this war, or will it require Israel's allies, Germany, the US, as you've said, turning off the taps?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think you've just introduced the problems besetting the Israeli economy so well. And that Fitch downgrade is really important. Okay, you're going from A+ to A, doesn't sound like a big deal. But actually, Israel has been viewed as a poster child of economic growth, particularly in West Asia, for a couple of decades. Its deficit going, I think, over 7.5% is a big deal. A large deficit is always a big deal, but it's particularly a big deal when global interest rates are slightly higher, because it means that the cost of servicing a higher debt, and of course a debt is overall a reflection of one's deficit. The national debt is the accumulated deficits one runs over a sustained period of time. That costs the taxpayer lots of money. You know, when you've got very, very cheap credit, having a large public debt or running large deficits doesn't really matter. But we're not in that world anymore. We're in a very different world to what we've been really since 2010. So a large deficit, like you say, suppressed growth, and actually sometimes your economy can do really well during a war. Just ask Russia. If you have a domestic military-industrial complex, if you've got full employment all of a sudden because you're having to do a draft, you've got ancillary industries having to basically absorb loads of labor. Russia's economy is booming. It's booming. And that's not me just making it up. It's in the FT, great features being written on a weekly basis practically. And that's not the case with Israel because, of course, it imports a lot of its technology, or nearly all of its military technology, frankly. And it's dependent on US foreign aid, defense imports from Germany and the United States. And then, of course, there are sectors, like you say, like hospitality, tourism, Simply put, they have fallen off a cliff. So this is a really, really major problem for, yes, Israel's soft power, the image it can project to the rest of the world. We talk about things like Eurovision. It can seem quite fatuous, but actually that has really big material implications for tens of thousands of Israeli businesses, large and small, who frankly are looking at hitting the wall. It's a major, major issue. And so the deficit matters, the falling growth matters. When you had Iron Dome shoot down, what was it, about 200 plus Iranian ballistic missiles, loitering munitions, drones, that is estimated to have cost $1 billion plus. Now, the United States can subsidize these efforts for, a year, maybe 18 months, maybe 2 years. But this is not an effective model by which you can prolong your war economy. And that's what Israel is trying to do right now. It's running a war economy through deficits in US aid, right? And that's not really viable. If you had a complete mobilization of assets, of material assets, of people, of technology, of resources, Israel, frankly, isn't a very big country. It doesn't have many people. And you hear people on the Israeli right talk about themselves as if they were the British Empire in 1940-41. We can fight alone. You really can't. Really, you can't. And you would have major problems simply against Hezbollah and Iran, let alone the entire region turning against you. Of course, there are sensible people in Israeli politics and public life who know that, but there's not many of them in government right now. You have Smotrich, who, as far as I know, Rivkah, maybe you can correct me, this senior politician now from the Israeli far right in government. He said, don't worry about the deficit. It's actually going to be lower than they say. It's falling. And I did a bit of research before this show. Well, what does Smotrich know? Is he a macroeconomist? Has he been in business? Is he an activist? Does he care about this policy area? Did he work in a think tank or an NGO maybe? No. He's a qualified lawyer, but frankly, he's been a lifelong pro-settlements, ultra-Zionist, ultra-Orthodox activist. That's what he does. And the big problem now for the Israeli body politic and the Israeli state is you have nitwits like that man confronted with a massive set of economic problems, and they're pretending that nothing's really happening. Nobody, I think, in the early weeks of this conflict on the Israeli side expected it to last as long as it has and cost as much as it has. And I think now, surely, you imagine, after the downgrade, after the deficit, after the clear shift in public opinion right across the global north. Okay, Bibi Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, maybe they won't change their tune, but you have to think there are moderately intelligent people within the Israeli army, within the Israeli central bank, who are having a quiet word and saying, look, if we have another year like the last year, actually the fundamentals of our economy look quite different. We've had a very fortunate several decades, demographically, high birth rates, high economic growth, high technology innovation, but nobody owes us that, right? That's not God-given, although I suppose some of them do actually think it's God-given. We could lose that. And actually, as a nation state, we could start falling very fast for a very long time. And I think, frankly, this could be the beginning of the end in terms of Israel's status as a high-income, high-productivity economy. If you lose your hospitality sector overnight, I mean, it's kind of a big deal, unless, of course, you're Smotrich or Ben-Gvir.
I think that's a really good point. But I think my fear is that many within Israel will be happy, value Israel's status as a kind of high-tech hub or, even as a tourist sort of destination, far less than they value its status as a kind of a dominant military force in the region, and will do everything they can. And not just a dominant military force in the region, but also as the kind of controllers of Palestinian life, effectively. Like, they're not going to let go, and they will kind of bleed Israel's economy dry, at least I fear, because they are ideologues who care much more about defeating the Amaleks than they do about having a thriving economy. Quite frankly, many of the people supporting this war are not wealthy people, and I think it's just it's hard to kind of communicate how ideologically invested Israeli society is in the war, and how that kind of investment, the mandatory conscription, the universal mandatory conscription, it just creates a society of soldiers. It's not quite comparable to, say, Russia, where, a peasant army has kind of had to be whipped out of thin air. These are people who've been training and preparing their whole lives for this moment, and somehow do see it, I fear, as the fulfillment of a certain kind of destiny. And, all notions of Israel as it's kind of paradoxical in a way, because like Israel's whole shtick as being a Western state in the middle of the kind of dusty, barren Middle East. But actually, I don't really think that that's in many ways how Israel sees itself. I do think it sees itself as particularly its current kind of cabinet, as something kind of loftier and more kind of divine. And I think that is exactly what is going to, as this Major General Yitzhak Brik says, like, lead it down a very dangerous path. So I'd like to also consider the second reason, before you get carried away, that Israel might be insisting on the occupation of the Philadelphia and Netzarim corridors, which is land. Earlier this week, analysis by forensic architecture showed that Israeli troops have been clearing a third corridor. Satellite imagery shows that between November last year and July this year, homes, farms, and orchards have been cleared, creating a new highway from Israel directly into Gaza City. According to forensic architecture, the highways are, quote, infrastructural indications of an intended permanent Israeli military presence in the northern parts of the occupied Gaza Strip. Most of the Palestinian population is now in southern Gaza. By cutting off the north from the south and building supply lines into Gaza City, Israel could effectively construct two enclaves. That would be in keeping with the country's strategy in the West Bank, separating areas under at least nominal Palestinian control from each other by areas wholly controlled by Israel. Splitting and weakening Palestinian areas in the West Bank has been key to enabling Israeli settlements to encroach into Palestinian territory, another way in which Palestinian sovereignty is made incrementally impossible. Aaron, why do you think Israel is doubling down on these corridors as a condition in any ceasefire negotiation?
Well, the obvious answer would be leverage. But like you say, Rivkah, we are dealing with ideologues. And I think even from the perspective of someone like Russia, it is quite different. There's a measure of realpolitik with what's going on with Russia, Ukraine. Yes, of course, Putin believes in a Russian-speaking world. I think Ruski Mir. Yes, of course. But Israel is so unique in so many ways. I mean, this is one fact that I don't think people talk about enough, is that Israel's population today, including Arabs within Israel, I'm not talking about Gaza and I'm not talking about the West Bank, but it's about 10 million people. It's projected to hit about 14 million people by the midpoint of the century because of its high birth rates. And this is a country, it's a settler colony, which just is so profoundly different from those of Europe, North America. You have not got an aging population, potentially shrinking like Central and Eastern Europe. You've actually got an expanding population. And like you say, many of the people are very ideological. In fact, younger people are more ideological than older people. And so I do think it makes these kinds of questions quite incomprehensible in terms of trying to ascertain their political relevance. I think the obvious answer is just leverage, but ultimately, like you say, the project here is a greater Israel, and I think that has to be the prism through which you answer all of these questions. And I think the question which besets people within sort of the Israeli establishment is, well, how quickly do we want to do it? I think before October 7th, people were thinking in terms of generations. Now they're thinking in terms of years, maybe decades.
If you thought the days of rising energy prices were over, I have some very bad news for you. From October, the typical household can expect to see a rise of £149 per year in their energy costs. It comes as energy regulator Ofgem has raised the cap on prices energy firms can charge for each unit of gas or electricity. And it means that people using an average amount of their energy will see their bills go up by 10% to just over £1,700 a year. Now, we've seen these kinds of rises before. In 2022, the cap rose twice, once by 54% in April that year. Gosh, incredible thinking back to it, 54%. And then again by 80% in October. They shot up again in January of 2023. Those increases were blamed on supply issues caused by the war in Ukraine. But the impact on consumers was offset to some extent by the Tories' energy price guarantee and the energy bills support scheme. Still, households saw their energy bills increase by 27% in that period. I'm sure many of you still remember the kind of shocking feeling of getting those much higher bills through the post. From July last year, prices began to stabilise. And while we're still paying almost double what we were for energy than we were before the war in Ukraine, today's cap rise, I should say, takes energy prices back to what they were in April this year. During the steep increases in 2022 and 2023, people on fixed incomes like pensioners and benefit recipients were the hardest hit. That led to stories like this.
Elsie is 77. She's a widow and she's a pensioner who lives in a council house. She receives a pension of £170 a week. Her energy bills have gone, get this, from £17 a month to £85 a month.
Yeah.
She will pay an additional £816 a year. To cut down on spending, Prime Minister, Elsie has now resorted to eating one meal a day. She's 77 years old. She's losing weight. She goes to the supermarket at the end of the day to buy yellow sticker discounted items. She gets up early in the morning to use her Freedom bus pass to stay on buses all day to avoid using energy at home.
It's actually kind of harrowing listening to that story. An old woman sitting on a bus just to not have to sit at home in front of the fire, or it's just so sad. Now we have a Labour government that's recently cut the winter fuel allowance, I can't actually believe I'm saying this, for all but the poorest pensioners, robbing them of up to £300 a year. With the price cap rise, that could amount to an effective annual loss of up to £450 a year for an average energy user. That's a lot of money if you don't have much. And there's no additional support for rising energy bills on offer. That means we could soon be hearing stories like Elsie's again this coming winter, which has led money-saving expert Martin Lewis to call for the reinstatement of the winter fuel payments to all pensioners. So why are prices rising again? Speaking to BBC Breakfast, Ofgem boss Jonathan Brearley explained.
But what we're announcing today is a 10% increase in the price cap. That's the regulated price that we lay out that says that's the maximum a company can charge if you're not in the wider market, if you're not on, for example, a fixed deal. Now, the reason we're making that change is those price increases are driven by the increase in cost in the international gas that we buy. And as an energy system, we spend a great deal of our sort of proportion of our bill on gas to provide our electricity and our heating. And until that changes, we will be in a similar position.
Okay, I see. It's external gas prices driving up our household energy costs, except, as Brearley went on, it turned out that wasn't quite the full story.
Can you explain to us in the clearest possible terms why that 10% figure can't be 6%? Why can it not be 8%? Why can you not just fix that price lower?
Well, the main reason is that the price cap is designed in a way that says, look, energy companies can recover fair costs and a small profit, but no more than that. And when those costs change, those costs unfortunately do feed through to the bill. Now, as a regulator, as you can imagine, we do everything we can to bear down on those costs. So we are continually challenging the companies and saying, can you do things cheaper?
There we have it, a small profit. It's interesting wondering who exactly is bearing down on who. My suspicion would be that it is the energy companies that are in fact bearing quite heavily down on people like Brearley. Small profit turns out not to be quite so small indeed. Just 6 months ago, energy supplier British Gas posted its 2023 profits, which leapt from 72 to £751 million in a year. And while Ofgem boss Jonathan Brearley might sound sympathetic, bear in mind that the energy regulator paid him £330,000 just last year. Meanwhile, Labour Minister Ed Miliband took to Twitter to express his concern about the price cap rise. Today's announcement from Ofgem will be worrying news for families across the country, Miliband said. The expected rise in the price cap is yet another consequence of the toxic legacy left by the previous government. If only we could get the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero on the phone. Aaron, Jonathan Brearley says 10% is a reasonable increase so that companies can recover their costs and make what he says, small profit. Meanwhile, you have the CEO of BP saying a couple of years ago that the country is effectively a cash machine. Have we totally lost a grip on what constitutes a small profit?
Well, absolutely. When you look at the sort of the tapeworm economy, as I like to call it, of privatization outsourcing, because they look at every little place they can get a little bit of value and they extract the value like a tapeworm in somebody's stomach. What does that mean? It means you get no nutrition, you get no sustenance, you get ill, you get sick, you lose weight, all because you're feeding this little parasite in your large intestine. And that's basically what privatized energy, mail, rail, water, and outsourcing does, right? They are constantly trying to parasitize value and look after themselves. And we see that with water. We see it with Thames Water. You know, these companies don't necessarily make a massive, massive profit, but they make a little profit each year. They pay the dividends. And of course, the executive pay is very, very good. You do that over 20, 30, 40 years. Well, guess what? You don't invest in infrastructure. You do that over 20, 30, 40 years, you don't really give a good deal to working people. And it's drip, drip, drip. Again, going back to water, if you look at the basic rate of inflation since the late 1980s when water was privatized, then I think the cost of private water bills are about an extra 50% on top of that. Similar story with industry after industry after industry. Of course, it's not the same in every European country. You look at France, very different. Why? Well, partly because, of course, they invested in nuclear over the last several decades. But in this particular instance, you know, I find it really interesting as well that you have a base rate of interest today, right now, basic rate of inflation rather, is just over 2%. Okay, the target is 2% or lower. Right now, it's about 2.1, 2.2%. But then you've got the energy cap going up by 10%. Now, I wonder, Rivkah, I've got a question for you. How many of these energy companies are going to increase the wages of their employees by 10%?
Yeah, I mean, zero.
I'm going to say none of them. And we saw this time after time during the cost of living crisis, which was it would be a water company or a rail company, a rail operator or an energy company. And they would go to their customers and they would say, I'm so sorry, or the Royal Mail, I'm so sorry, inflation is so high. We've got to increase prices. I'm sorry, we can't do anything about it. The base rate of inflation is 10%. Your price is going to go up 12%. Then they'd speak to their employees. I know you want a pay rise. We can't afford it. Inflation. But hold on. You're charging consumers more. You're charging more for the stamps. You're charging more for the electricity, for the water, for the rail journeys. But you're saying for the same reason that means you can charge more for those things is the exact same reason I can't earn more. Or I can at least, I'm going to get poorer in real terms, but I don't have to get really poor really quickly. So it takes me back, like I say, to this idea of the tapeworm economy. You see it in Royal Mail, a centuries-old organization which is being dismantled in real time. You see it with water. You see it with energy. You see it with rail. You see it absolutely everywhere. And so I think it's a very important point to make, Rivkah. They turn a small profit. Well, there shouldn't be a profit. Okay? We have a prime minister in this country as well who's on £175,000 a year. Why on earth are there people, CEOs, in private water companies, private energy companies, earning 3-4 times as much as that, sometimes more? You know, it's obviously unacceptable. There are certain water companies. I think it's Thames Valley or maybe Southern. You know, the CEO of Southern, his bonus for the first 3 months of this year, his bonus was the same as the annual salary of the Prime Minister. Something's clearly gone seriously wrong. And we have people like this gentleman who's a regulator. He's working on behalf of the state and on the consumer, earning hundreds of thousands of pounds a year, saying, no, it's fine. It's all normal.
Yeah. No,
Don't get upset about it.
I agree. And it's incredible how these conversations can happen with absolutely no reference to inflation. I think your reference to inflation just there is probably the first we've heard of mention of inflation. You know, in that interview just then that we excerpted, the interviewer is asking, why not 6%? Why not 8%? Well, that's way, those figures are also way higher than inflation. Why, when it comes to workers' wages, do we always have to, measure against inflation, above inflation pay rises, below inflation pay rises, whereas capitalists or landlords in particular can just determine what kind of pay rise they'd like that year. They just pick a number out of the air. It could be 6, it could be 8, it could be 10. They decide. Whereas workers are constantly held hostage to inflation as if that is the arbiter of what's reasonable. But inflation never enters into the discussion when it comes to what should BP's bonuses be. We have a regulator for a reason. You would think we've got an entire body whose sole purpose is to make sure that what the energy companies are charging is reasonable. And yet, the standards of kind of that are being applied to these energy cap rises appear to me incredibly flimsy. Like, what's going on behind the scenes? Honestly, I would love to know what discussions are being had, who is sitting on who, such that 10% feels like a reasonable thing to suggest at a time when people are already feeling so squeezed. I think it's such an important question to ask. Thank you so much, Aaron. We've come to the end of the show. It's been wonderful to have you. I hope it hasn't been too much of a crash landing after your lovely holiday.
It hasn't been at all. And you know what, Rivkah, the next time somebody whinges about rail drivers asking for a pay rise or junior doctors asking for a pay rise of 10%, say, did you make this much noise when it was the energy cap going up by 10%? Because I don't remember.
Yeah, no, exactly. We should be consistent with our questioning. That's the one thing Novara Live can guarantee you, to ask the questions that the mainstream media will not. Thank you for everyone watching this evening's show. We'll be back on Tuesday. You've been watching Novara Live. Good night.